Chapter 1. The Omen. Father Elias Lancaster had encountered many horrors in his lifetime, but the letter that arrived at St. Augustine's Cathedral carried an unease unlike any other. The parchment was old, its edges frayed as if handled by trembling hands. The ink was smeared in places, but the words remained clear. "My daughter is possessed. Please come quickly before it is too late." The letter was signed by Margaret Bellamy, a widow living in an isolated estate on the outskirts of Black Hollow. Elias had heard whispers of the Bellamy estate, a place steeped in tragedy and misfortune. The family had been prominent once, their wealth and influence undeniable, but death had come for them one by one, leaving only Margaret and her daughter, Isabella. Townsfolk avoided the estate, claiming it was cursed. The thought of what might be lurking within its walls sent a shiver down his spine, but his duty as an exorcist left no room for hesitation. Packing his Bible, holy water, and sacred relics, Elias whispered a quiet prayer. He had faced demons before, but something about this case felt different. Darker, more insidious. The journey to the Bellamy estate was treacherous. The road twisted through thick, gnarled woods, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the wind howled through the trees like the cries of the damned. The deeper he ventured into the forest, the colder the air became, as if the very land rejected his presence. By the time Elias arrived, night had fully descended, cloaking the manor in oppressive darkness. The estate loomed before him, its once pristine facade marred by time and decay. The towering structure bore the weight of history. Cracked stone walls, ivy creeping through the fissures, windows dark and lifeless like empty eye sockets. The massive iron gate groaned as he pushed it open, its rusted hinges screaming in protest. Margaret met him at the entrance, her face drawn with exhaustion. Her once beautiful features were gaunt, her eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. She clutched a rosary in her frail hands, fingers trembling as she spoke. "Thank you for coming, Father," she whispered, barely audible over the howling wind. "She's upstairs, but I fear it may already be too late." Elias followed her through dimly lit corridors where candlelight flickered like dying souls. The air smelled of damp wood and something fouler, something rancid, hidden beneath the surface. The mansion felt wrong. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor, and the walls seemed to breathe as if the house itself was alive. As they ascended the grand staircase, Elias heard it. A faint scratching sound like nails against wood. It grew louder with each step, a frantic, desperate noise that set his teeth on edge. Margaret stopped before a heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway. Her grip on the rosary tightened. "She's in there," she whispered, voice trembling. From the other side of the door came a guttural growl, inhuman, deep and filled with malice. A voice that did not belong to a child. The hairs on Elias's arms stood on end. "She won't let me inside anymore," Margaret admitted, her voice breaking. "She screams when I try. She's no longer my Isabella." Elias gripped his crucifix, steeling himself before placing a hand on the door. The wood was unnaturally cold, sending an icy shock through his fingertips. Taking a deep breath, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was a shrine to madness. The once elegant furnishings were in disarray, the bed overturned, deep claw marks gouged into the floorboards. Tattered curtains fluttered despite the windows being shut. Symbols were scrawled across the walls in what appeared to be blood, their meanings lost to time. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something far worse, sulfur. And then he saw her. Isabella Bellamy sat in the corner, her back to the door, her long black hair hanging in tangled, greasy strands. Her dress, once white, was stained with dirt and something darker. Her breathing was shallow, ragged. "Isabella?" Elias called gently. Her head snapped around with unnatural speed, revealing a face that was no longer that of a little girl. Her once rosy skin was now an ashen gray, her cheeks sunken, her lips cracked and peeling. But it was her eyes that sent ice through his veins, black as voids, endless and hungry. She grinned, a slow, stretching movement that exposed jagged, yellowed teeth. "You are too late, priest," she rasped, her voice layered with something else, something ancient and malevolent. The air thickened, the temperature plummeted. The girl's body convulsed violently as an unseen force threw furniture across the room. The shadows deepened, twisting into grotesque forms that slithered along the walls. Whispers filled the air, voices overlapping, speaking in tongues, unknown to mortal men. Elias raised his Bible, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "By the power of Christ, I command you to reveal yourself." Isabella's head tilted unnaturally, her grin widening. "You cannot save her," she whispered, though her lips did not move. "She belongs to me now." The shadows surged forward, swallowing the candlelight, plunging the room into darkness. The battle had begun. Chapter 2. The First Confrontation. Father Elias stepped into the room, his breath visible in the frigid air. The moment he crossed the threshold, an unnatural force pressed against his chest, suffocating and oppressive. The candlelight flickered violently, shadows twisting across the walls like grasping hands. In the far corner, Isabella sat hunched, her limbs contorted in an inhuman way, her eyes pits of abyssal blackness. A grin, too wide for her face, stretched her cracked lips. The child was barely there. Something else lurked beneath her skin. Margaret clutched her rosary behind him, her whisper a tremulous plea. "Please, Father, save my daughter." Elias raised his crucifix, its presence barely a flicker of light against the suffocating darkness. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave this child." The walls groaned, the air thickening with an unseen presence. A low, guttural laugh bubbled up from Isabella's throat. No, from the thing inside her. "She is ours now, priest." The voice was layered, voices upon voices, seething with malice. Elias took a step forward, holding up his Bible. "Reveal yourself, unclean spirit. Name yourself." The room shook violently. The wooden floorboards cracked, an unseen force splintering them apart. A putrid stench filled the air, decay and sulfur. The shutters banged open, and an icy wind howled through, carrying whispers in a language that had no place in this world. Isabella's body convulsed violently, her spine arching until her head nearly touched the small of her back. Then, with grotesque, jerking motions, she snapped upright, her head lolling. "You wish to see me, priest?" she rasped. The candle flames extinguished, total darkness. Then, in the void, the sound of skittering, nails against wood, something crawling, moving unnaturally fast. Elias barely had time to react before Isabella lunged, propelled by an unseen force. Her fingers, clawed and elongated, raked against his robes, her strength unnatural. Elias staggered, thrusting the crucifix forward. "By the blood of Christ, begone!" He splashed holy water upon her. A hiss erupted from her throat, a sound not of pain but of amusement. Her skin sizzled where the water touched, black veins spidering from the burn. "You cannot stop what has already begun." The demon crooned, its grin stretching further, too far, splitting the corners of her mouth. Margaret sobbed, gripping the doorway. "Isabella, please, fight it." The girl's head snapped toward her mother, her lips peeling back in a snarl. "She is gone," the demon sneered. "And soon, you will be too." With a sickening crunch, Isabella's limbs twisted, bones snapping as she lifted off the ground. Her eyes rolled back into her skull, her body hovering. The room itself groaned as if alive, the shadows creeping like sentient entities. The whispers turned into guttural wails, cries of the damned echoing through the walls. Elias held his ground, voice unwavering. "You will not have her soul. In the name of the Almighty, I cast you out." The demon shrieked, its voice shrill enough to make the glass in the lamp burst. The air thickened, pressing against Elias's chest like an iron weight. But he did not falter. A final, violent convulsion racked Isabella's body. Her mouth stretched open, a shadowy, writhing mass escaping with a wail of agony. The blackness surged toward the walls, disappearing into the crevices as the house shuddered violently. Then, silence. Isabella collapsed, motionless. Margaret rushed to her daughter, cradling the trembling child in her arms. "Is she free?" she asked, voice breaking with hope and fear. Elias's grip tightened on his crucifix. The air remained heavy, charged with something unseen. He knew the truth. "For now," he murmured, "but it is not over." From the darkened corners of the room, something laughed, soft, mocking, a promise of terror yet to come. Chapter 3. The Awakening of Shadows. Elias did not sleep that night. The house, though still and quiet on the surface, pulsed with a presence he could not shake. He sat at the dining table, Bible open before him, yet the words blurred under the weight of exhaustion. Margaret had taken Isabella to her room, and for now the girl remained unconscious. But he knew this was not over. A sharp knock echoed through the house. Elias stiffened. The clock read 3:13 a.m. Who would be at the door at such an ungodly hour? Slowly he rose, each footstep echoing in the silence. He unlatched the door, peering into the darkness beyond. Nothing but the wind stirring the dead leaves. Then a whisper, not outside, but behind him. His blood ran cold as he turned, heart hammering against his ribs. The dining room candle had extinguished, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight seeping through the window. And in the center of the room stood Isabella. Her eyes were open now, but they were not hers. Hollow and black, deep as the abyss. Her mouth hung slightly open, a trickle of blackened drool slipping down her chin. "Father," she rasped, her voice layered, echoing, ancient. Elias reached for his crucifix. "Isabella, you must fight this. Do not let it take you." Her lips twisted into a grotesque grin. "She is gone. I remain." Before he could react, Isabella lunged, an unseen force propelling her forward. Elias barely had time to lift his Bible before her hands wrapped around his throat, ice cold and impossibly strong. The world tilted, the room spinning as he crashed onto the floor, his breath choked by the relentless grip of possessed child. Margaret's scream pierced the air. The grip loosened for a fraction of a second, enough time for Elias to break free. He scrambled backward, gasping. Isabella's body convulsed, her limbs jerking violently. Then, with an inhuman shriek, she scuttled backward on all fours, her body moving with grotesque speed and precision. Margaret sobbed. No, please, let her go." The demon inside her daughter merely tilted its head. "Would you like to see what she sees, Mother?" Elias forced himself to his feet, raising the crucifix. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I cast you out." Isabella let out a guttural snarl. The lights flickered. The very walls trembled. Shadows pulled at her feet, writhing like living tendrils. "You think you can stop what is already woven into the fabric of this house?" she hissed. With a deafening crash, every window in the house shattered at once. Shards of glass flew through the air, yet not a single one struck Elias or Margaret. The demon laughed, low, guttural, a sound that did not belong in this world. The walls pulsed like breathing flesh. Isabella's body contorted further, her back arching until her head nearly touched the floor. Her jaw unhinged, her mouth stretching impossibly wide. A hideous wet sound emerged, a whispering chorus of voices overlapping, speaking in tongues unknown. Elias pressed forward, forcing himself to remain steady. "By the blood of Christ, I command you to leave this child and return to the abyss." The demon screamed. The force of it sent the furniture toppling, the very air vibrating with its rage. Isabella's body convulsed violently, her eyes rolling back. And then, silence. The house stilled. The shadows slithered back into the crevices of the room. Isabella collapsed, limp, unmoving. Margaret rushed to her, sobbing. "Isabella? Baby, wake up!" Elias stepped forward cautiously, his heart still pounding. The girl's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. She was alive, but something still lingered in the air. A presence, watching, waiting. And in the farthest, darkest corner of the room, something chuckled softly. Chapter 4. The Unseen Terror. The air in the house grew heavier with each passing hour, thick with an unseen weight that pressed against Elias's chest. The previous night's confrontation had taken its toll, yet he knew the battle was far from over. Something remained in the house, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Margaret sat beside Isabella's bed, whispering soft prayers, her fingers clutching the rosary so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The girl was still unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin pale and clammy. But the worst part was the quiet, the unnatural, suffocating stillness that had settled over the house. It was the kind of silence that carried with it the promise of horror. Elias placed a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We cannot let our guard down. The entity has not left." Margaret turned to him, eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. "What else can we do? You drove it away last night, didn't you?" Elias sighed. "No, it retreated. It is still here, waiting." As if on cue, a deep groaning sound echoed through the walls. The wooden floor beneath them shuddered. Elias straightened, gripping his crucifix tightly. From the darkness beyond the hallway, the whispers began. Margaret whimpered. "Not again." Elias moved toward the door, his steps cautious. The whispers grew louder, indistinct but filled with malice. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then suddenly they stopped, a heartbeat of silence. Then a sharp knock at the door. Elias froze. Margaret gasped, clutching Isabella closer. The knock came again, louder this time. Slow, methodical. Something was on the other side. something that should not be there. Elias swallowed hard and took a step forward. "Who is there?" No answer. The doorknob twisted. The door creaked open just an inch, revealing an abyssal blackness beyond, an unnatural void where the hallway should have been. And then, from the darkness, a pale, emaciated hand emerged, fingers stretching unnaturally long. Elias reacted instinctively, raising his crucifix. "In the name of Christ, be gone." The hand recoiled, a hideous screech filling the air. The door slammed shut with such force that the walls trembled. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows twisted, writhing like living things. Then, Isabella's body jerked violently. Margaret screamed as her daughter arched off the bed, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Her eyes, which had been closed in unconsciousness, snapped open, pitch black, void of humanity. A guttural, unnatural voice slithered from her lips. "You think faith will save you?" Elias stepped forward, heart hammering, reciting scripture with unwavering determination. He flung holy water toward Isabella, but the drops sizzled against her skin, smoke rising where they touched. She shrieked, her body convulsing violently. "You are too late, priest." The room exploded into chaos. The furniture trembled, books and trinkets flying from shelves. The walls cracked, dark liquid oozing from the fissures like bleeding wounds. The whispers turned into wails, cries of suffering and rage echoing through the house. Elias pressed on, louder, stronger. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Isabella's screams turned inhuman, her body writhing as though something inside her was being torn away. The dark presence in the room lashed out, the very air vibrating with its fury. But Elias did not stop. With one final agonized shriek, Isabella collapsed onto the bed, her body limp. The house fell silent. Elias stood panting, sweat dripping down his face. Margaret sobbed, holding her daughter close, but something still felt wrong. Then from the darkness of the hallway came a soft, mocking chuckle. The demon had not left, it was only biding its time. Chapter 5. The Demon's Wrath. Elias barely had time to catch his breath before the room was plunged into an unnatural darkness. The candles flickered wildly before being snuffed out as if an unseen hand had smothered them. A suffocating pressure filled the air, heavy and oppressive, pressing against his chest like an iron weight. Margaret let out a strangled gasp as she clutched Isabella's limp body. The girl's skin was cold as ice, her breathing shallow, but her lips twitched, and a dark, mirthless chuckle slithered from her throat. "She's still here," Margaret whispered, voice barely audible. "Elias, please." Before she could finish, a force unseen ripped her away from Isabella, hurling her across the room. She struck the wall with a sickening thud and crumpled to the floor, moaning in pain. The air erupted with a cacophony of whispers, angry, malicious voices speaking in tongues unknown. They seeped from the walls, from the cracks in the floorboards, from the very air itself. Elias gritted his teeth and raised his crucifix. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to release this child." A deep, guttural growl echoed in response. Isabella's body levitated, her limbs hanging limp, her head lolling back at an unnatural angle. Then, with a sudden jolt, her eyes snapped open, black as the void, soulless and cruel. A horrible grin stretched across her face. "Foolish priest," she hissed, her voice layered with a dozen others. "You cannot banish what has already claimed its vessel." Elias stepped forward, unwavering. "You do not belong here. Leave this child and return to the abyss." The demon laughed, a sound so chilling it sent shivers down his spine. The house trembled violently, the walls splitting open with deep, jagged cracks. A shadow, amorphous and writhing, spilled from Isabella's mouth, curling and twisting like a serpent. Margaret clawed at the floor, trying to crawl back to her daughter. "Please, please let her go," she sobbed. The demon's gaze snapped to her. "Would you trade your soul for hers, mother?" Margaret froze, horror flooding her features. Elias interjected, his voice firm. "Do not listen. It seeks only to deceive." The shadowy mass spread, slithering toward Elias. It latched onto his feet, climbing up his legs like living tar. He gasped as an icy chill seeped into his bones. He could hear the whispers in his head now, dark promises of pain and despair. "You are weak, priest," the demon sneered. "You cannot stop what has begun." Elias clenched his jaw and summoned every ounce of faith he had. He thrust the crucifix forward. "By the blood of Christ, I bind you to the pit from whence you came." A shriek tore through the house, so loud it rattled the very foundation. Isabella's body convulsed violently, her limbs jerking, her mouth stretched open in a silent scream. The shadow recoiled, writhing as if in agony before snapping back into Isabella's body with a sickening crunch. Then, silence. The air was thick with tension. Isabella's body collapsed onto the bed, unmoving. The shadows slithered away into the cracks of the house, retreating but not gone. Margaret sobbed in relief, clutching her daughter's motionless form. Elias remained standing, gripping his crucifix tightly, his body trembling with exhaustion. But deep in the recesses of the house, something still watched. Waiting. And it was not finished yet. Chapter 6. The abyss stirs. The house was silent, but the kind of silence that smothered the air like a shroud of death. Elias stood in the dim light, his breath shallow, his heart hammering in his chest. Margaret sat beside Isabella, stroking her daughter's damp forehead, whispering prayers under her breath. Then the air shifted. A low, guttural whisper curled around Elias's ears, an insidious voice slithering from the shadows. "She is ours now." Elias turned sharply, gripping his crucifix, but the darkness was thick and undisturbed. The voice was everywhere and nowhere. The temperature plummeted, and the walls groaned as if something ancient pressed against them from within. Margaret gasped as Isabella's body jerked violently, her eyes snapping open. They were no longer the black voids from before, but gleamed a sickly yellow, burning with malice. Her lips curled into a grotesque smile. "Did you miss me, priest?" The voice was not Isabella's. It was layered with something deep and abyssal, something far older than any human soul. Elias swallowed, raising the crucifix. "I command you, in the name of Christ, release this child." The thing inside Isabella laughed, her small body twisting in ways it shouldn't, her bones cracking with every unnatural movement. She lifted off the bed, floating inches above the mattress. "You are weak, Elias," the demon taunted. "You cannot fight what is already inside you." Elias's grip faltered for just a moment. A sharp pain lanced through his skull, and suddenly he was elsewhere, a dark, endless void. Shadows stretched in every direction, moving unnaturally, as though they had form but no substance. Elias turned, but there was no escape, only darkness. Then, a presence loomed before him, vast and unspeakable. Twin burning eyes bore into his soul. "You have carried your faith for too long," the voice rumbled, shaking the very ground beneath him. "But even the faithful fall." Elias clenched his jaw. "I will never fall." The voice let out a terrible, echoing laugh. "Then why do you tremble?" A force slammed into Elias, and he was thrown back into reality. He stumbled, gasping, sweat dripping from his brow. Isabella was convulsing, dark veins crawling up her arms, her body struggling against the force holding her captive. Margaret screamed, "Do something!" Elias forced himself to his feet, raising the holy book. "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" The demon within Isabella shrieked, its fury shaking the house. Shadows curled up the walls, the floorboards splintering beneath them. A deep, guttural growl filled the air, and then, a sound like shattering glass. Isabella's body convulsed violently before crashing onto the bed. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, the shadows retreating like smoke. Elias collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. The battle was won, or so he thought. From the darkness beyond the doorway, something still watched, unseen and patient. Chapter 7. The Final Hour. Elias felt the air grow thick again, an unnatural weight pressing down on his chest. The battle wasn't over. Something still lingered in the shadows, unseen but undeniably present. The house groaned as if it were alive, its very structure rebelling against the sanctity Elias tried to restore. Margaret clutched Isabella's limp body, her eyes wild with terror. "She's not breathing. Elias, please!" Elias rushed to the bed, pressing his fingers against Isabella's neck. No pulse. Panic tightened around his throat like a noose, but he refused to accept it. He lifted his trembling hands and began to pray, his voice breaking. "Lord, I beseech you, grant this child your mercy. Return her to us." A violent force erupted from Isabella's body, throwing Elias across the room, his back slammed into the wall, pain exploding through his spine. As he struggled to his feet, a bone-chilling laughter filled the air. She was never yours to save. Isabella's eyes snapped open, but they were no longer human. They glowed an eerie, blood red, her pupils vertical slits like a serpent's. The demon had not left, it had only burrowed deeper. Elias gritted his teeth. "You will not take her?" The lights in the house flickered wildly, the walls cracked, dark ooze seeping from the fractures. A deafening screech filled the air, as if the very house was howling in agony. Isabella floated above the bed, her mouth stretching open impossibly wide, a deep abyss forming within. Elias staggered to his feet, gripping his crucifix tightly. He knew this was the endgame. Either he cast the demon out completely, or they would all be lost. He stepped forward and raised his voice. "I cast you out, unclean spirit. In the name of the Almighty I command you, be gone!" The demon shrieked, its unholy scream splitting the air. Isabella's body convulsed, the shadowy entity within her thrashing violently. Elias felt an unseen force crush his lungs, trying to suffocate him, but he did not waver. He pressed the crucifix to Isabella's forehead. The demon let out a final, ear-splitting howl. A rush of black smoke burst from her mouth, swirling into the air before vanishing with a deafening explosion. Isabella collapsed, her body still and silent. Margaret rushed forward, sobbing uncontrollably. Elias hesitated before placing his hand over Isabella's chest. A heartbeat. She gasped, her eyes fluttering open, no longer tainted by the darkness. She was back. Margaret wept, cradling her daughter. Elias staggered, exhaustion threatening to pull him under. He glanced around the room, the walls now still, the air lighter. It was over. Or so he thought. From the depths of the cracked floor, something unseen chuckled softly. Waiting. Because evil never truly dies.